We absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law.
We need to safeguard financial stability.
2024 is not going to be an easy year.
We used to call it the dream of home ownership, but look at Britain now.
We've got to hang on to optimism and hope because it is the biggest driver of change.
Let's stop thinking of life in terms of Brexit. Let's move on and look to the future.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm James Woolcock.
Welcome to the programme. It's Friday and we should be saying yes to life, but instead we're thinking about saying no. No, James.
No, James is a frequent moniker around the newsroom. No, James, no. Please, no more.
A lot of people saying no this week in politics, though, whether it's the hospital consultants who've turned down the government's latest pay offer or Canada saying no, or at least not now, to a trade deal with the UK. We had the First Minister Simon Clarke with a very firm no to Rishi Sunak earlier this week as well. Not a great week for the Prime Minister on that front.
I'm so glad you didn't include any newsroom anecdotes in that, Stephen. I could come out very badly. But, I mean, ultimately, though, some of these may be our setbacks. I mean, you yourself said the Canada one is not now. But there are only two no's that actually matter in politics. There is when the electorate say no, and there are when your own MPs say no. And for Rishi Sunak on that front, the one that is happening in the short term, it's actually been a relatively good week in that there was a backbench rebellion on the former Simon Clarke, who, although some may not have known him before this week, was a very senior Tory MP, which effectively imploded on arrival, with other sort of backbenchers like David Davis, Priti Patel, very experienced people basically saying this was farcical, silly, and that, in some ways, has cemented the PM's position.
You're saying that one rebellion is a good week for Rishi Sunak?
It shows that he can't be ousted that easily, and that there is an unwillingness to have that no of no confidence, despite all the rumours about letters that it has started going. I will caveat that by saying that when you listen to Tory MPs, one thing that is still making them extremely miserable is the poll in the Telegraph last week that did MRP polling to show their own constituencies. And it's like sort of when we do a news article that says, like, Google where you are, each MP looking up their postcode and going, oh no, I'm in deep trouble, has had a real effect on morale. Yeah,
and very interesting that particular no should be coming from the Telegraph, of all places. More on the Telegraph a little bit later in the programme. But turning now to another no that appears to have come from the Treasury. Bloomberg has learned the Treasury's warning ministers they may not have enough money to fund giveaways in the budget in March. The internal analysis estimates the Chancellor will have just £14 billion to play with when making his tax and spending decisions, a figure that's close to a historic low in modern budgeting. Joining us now, one of the reporters responsible for breaking this exclusive story, our UK government reporter, Joe Mays. Joe, what more can you tell us then about these estimates from the Treasury?
Well, yeah, so this is an internal Treasury assessment of what they think the money Hunt will have to spare to spend on tax and spending decisions at the budget. You know, this isn't a final assessment, but it's their own internal thinking before they get the official estimates from the Office for Budget Responsibility. And so, yeah, it's really a big question of, how much will he have? Does he have enough to cut taxes significantly? And I think that my sense is that the Treasury are playing it quite cautious here. And they're saying, look, our headroom is, as you mentioned, near those historic lows, and it's going to be tight, right? But, these numbers can change as we get closer to the budget. It was looking quite good in December. It was up near kind of 25 billion, that headroom. But market conditions have deteriorated. The lower inflation is dragging down tax receipts. So all this factors into a pretty cautious picture from the Treasury.
I feel very vindicated, Joe, because just recently on this podcast I said there's not much going on in the Treasury that you don't know. Is this a blow for the government spending plans then? Like, will these tax cuts that have been promised still come? And where is that difference likely to be made up?
Well, see, the thing is that there's always this natural caution in the Treasury when they come up with these spending plans. So I don't doubt that Jeremy Hunt would have said to his economists, present to me a kind of a realistic, cautious picture of where we could find ourselves with the public finances come budget day. And therefore, the economists have gone away and have come back with this cautious assessment. It could be the case that the conditions improve in the next month and suddenly Hunt has more to play with. I mean, that's what happened at the autumn statement. At the autumn statement, in the early parts of the process, Hunt looked like he didn't have much money at all. And then suddenly, by the end, he had 30 billion of headroom to play with, and he spent 18 billion of that on a corporate tax break and a payroll tax cut. So these things can change. Hunt will be hoping it does change like that for the positive again. And obviously, this is an election year. There's big pressure on him to deliver something that will turn the polls around for the Tories. So yeah, a really interesting position he's in.
Joe, is this expectation management on behalf of the Treasury?
It could be that. It could be that. I mean, it's in their interest that Tory MPs don't get too excited about the prospect of big tax cuts because then they're likely to disappoint them. So they want to kind of under-promise, over-deliver. That's what you think Jeremy Hunt would want to do. So it's perhaps in their interest for it to be the idea that there isn't much headroom, but it could also be the case that there just isn't much headroom, and that just is a factually true thing. It's hard to say.
Does that mean, though, that there are going to be ministers in the Tory government now apoplectic at the idea that they're not going to get the much promised tax cuts? How much of a political issue is this going to create within the party?
Well, I think that political backlash is the kind of thing that will come after the event. I think at this time, a lot of Tory MPs know that this is the game that the Treasury might be playing with expectation management. But certainly there'll be some disquiet on their part if they think they cannot deliver those tax cuts, because so many of them see it as so crucial to the election prospects of later this year. So, yeah, I expect Jeremy Hunt to come under a bit of pressure. I mean, he's meeting Tory MPs, in coming weeks for their ideas on the budget. It's a difficult balancing act, isn't it? He's got a lot of stakeholders who all want to see certain things, and there's only a limited pot of money to play with.
Joe, let's just talk through some of the ideas that are being floated around as to where the money could go, even if it is a reduced amount of money. What are the key priorities for Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak in this budget?
I think the big one that we're all looking for is an income tax cut. I mean, both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have said that if the public finances allow, they want to reduce the tax burden further, and they're specifically interested in, cutting taxes that will help reduce the cost of living, and income tax is the biggest one. And that's obviously the biggest one in terms of people really understand it. Obviously, it affects the whole demographic. It affects pensioners as well. They get the benefit. So I think that's a big one to look for. And also question marks over things like stamp duty, inheritance tax. Could you do things on those? Maybe. But I think if money is tight, I think they want to prioritize the kind of biggest impact, headline grabbing measure, which would likely be an income tax cut. There's also questions over things like child benefit, changes the rules around that. Martin Lewis is campaigning a lot to change one of the thresholds there. So that's one to look out for. But yeah, I keep my eyes on income tax.
On that kind of campaigning front, Joe, is there any unified position outside of the government in the Tory backbenchers of what they want beyond tax cuts? So this week has seen everything from calls for more defence spending to local council funding, even sort of NHS funding, in terms of doctor strikes. Do MPs know what they want beyond tax cuts?
I think that if you look at the kind of the very right-wing caucus in the Conservative Party, which has been the kind of most prominent in the press in recent weeks, as you were talking about Simon Clarke's intervention. I mean, he was talking about the need for a radical agenda around planning reform, for example. That's another thing. But I think you're right to say that it's a fairly disparate collection of requests that are coming into the Chancellor. I mean, I think the tax cuts one is the common one amongst those requests, but across the piece, it's all sorts of big things. And with a government that has little time left until the end of this Parliament, until the next election, it's a tricky one for them, especially things like planning reform. You thought that would have to have happened in the last few years. But tax cuts is the key one.
Joe Mays, our UK government reporter, thank you very much for coming to tell us about your big scoop, and we'll have to have you back as the budget gets closer.
Now, we mentioned the Telegraph earlier, and the newspaper's future ownership is getting a lot of attention from the government. An Abu Dhabi-backed investment vehicle, Redbird IMI, is trying to buy the group, but the deal is raising concerns about media freedoms. It's already been the subject of scrutiny by the media and competition regulators, and more investigations could be on the way. The case does raise some interesting questions, though, about the role of media in politics, as well as media ownership here in the UK. And joining us to discuss is Rasmus Nielsen, Professor of Political Communication at the University of Oxford and Director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism as well. Rasmus, great to have you with us on the programme. The government's paying an awful lot of attention to this deal around the ownership of the Telegraph. Are they right to be so worried when it comes to media ownership?
I mean, newspapers are much diminished, but they still play a very important role in political debate and public opinion in this country. So it's very important to scrutinize this, in particular in a situation where the backers of the new entity may raise a lot of issues.
Does it say something about our social media age, Rasmus, that a paper is viewed on a par with some national security assets?
I mean, this would have arguably been even more important 20 years ago than it is today. The Telegraph still has a significant readership, so it does play some role in public opinion, though arguably probably more important in terms of internal Conservative Party politics and its influence on how other news media cover issues of the day. So I don't really think that this is sort of about the moment we find ourselves in, as much as it's about the fact that there are, at the end of the day, a limited number of national newspapers in this country. They are very important for elite opinion formation, play some role in mass politics. And every time they change hands, it is arguably something that needs to be scrutinized.
So this isn't something that's just about the Telegraph, because, you know, the link that many are making is obviously some very prominent conservative politicians have written for the Telegraph, and it's seen as being part of their DNA as well. This is an issue that we've also seen more broadly when it comes to media plurality in the UK.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the Telegraph is probably only the Spectator. Its sister title really has anything like this important in terms of internal party politics in the Conservative Party. And as you say, there does seem to be a bit of a revolving door and sometimes quite opaque relationships here in terms of individual members of the party. And of course, we also know historically that the Barclay brothers were very explicit about aligning the paper with the Conservative Party. It's a matter of public record that Aidan Barclay texted David Cameron in 2010 to encourage him to talk daily to the then editor of the Daily Telegraph to ensure that the party could get its message across in the election campaign, even as he was also at the same time trying to lobby the Conservative leader on various policy issues. So the links here are very close. It's very intertwined. But, you know, again, I think we really need to recognize that even if they don't have the kind of mass audience that they used to have, or the kind of influence over public opinion at large they used to have, every national newspaper in this country plays an important role in politics. And it's important to scrutinize any possible owners, either through the lens of media concentration. There are some of the, you know, entities that wanted to buy the Telegraph that already own a lot of media in this country, but also through the lens of any sort of geopolitical entanglements that they may bring with them.
That being said, Rasmus, I mean, is there, as we head into this general election, a case that we should be a bit more obsessed with social media and how that's being regulated? I mean, if we talk about foreign owners, a lot of big social media platforms are US owned, or in the case of China, owned by ByteDance. Sorry, in the case of TikTok, sorry, owned by ByteDance. Should we, politicians in Westminster, be more concerned with how that is being regulated?
Well, I mean, I would hope that there is bandwidth to worry about more than one thing at the same time. I mean, otherwise, there is not much hope for any kind of policy or regulation. So I think it's very important to scrutinize the ownership, but probably more importantly, the sort of operations and relative lack of transparency of large social media platforms. You know, there's been a lot of attention paid to that in Parliament and in Westminster in recent years, with the whole discussions around the online safety bill and other issues around market concentration and the like. So I think this is a very live and very urgent discussion. But the rising prominence of social media and the relative decline of newspapers do not mean that newspapers are not important. Newspapers increasingly are read only by a relatively small elite audience, but those relatively small elite audiences play a outsized role in internal party politics. They can be decisive in leadership campaigns, for example, as we have arguably seen in recent years in the Conservative Party. They can influence the line of the political party on the day-to-day basis when there is a long time to the next general election. And also importantly, if some of the news media still have mass reach, such as the BBC, but also other Ofcom regulated broadcasters, are in part looking towards the major national newspapers when they make decisions about how to cover issues of the day, what to cover. And in that sense, the Telegraph, in addition to the importance it plays in Conservative Party politics, is also important for the way in which it's one of the factors that may influence how widely relied upon broadcasters cover national politics in an election year.
How much trust is there in the UK media? I mean, this is an issue around one newspaper that sort of brought into focus its ownership, but considering winning an election year, and we're taking into account what you've said about the influence that newspapers have and more broadly over other media outlets as well, is the UK media trustworthy?
Well, those are two different questions. I mean, the question of whether they're trustworthy, I think that's for every citizen to make their own decision about whether they believe the news media as a whole or any individual news organization is trustworthy. I don't think I have any particular right to sit in a plush office in Oxford and tell other people who they should rely upon. But we can research whether people do in fact find the media as a whole or individual news media trustworthy, and there the findings are very clear. Most people in the UK are very skeptical of most news media. It's just 33% in 2023 who said that they think they, on balance, find most news media trustworthy most of the time. There are some very important exceptions to this. The BBC is very highly and very broadly trusted, also by most people who are politically on the right, as is Channel 4, ITV, and a few other titles. The upmarket national newspapers generally have relatively high levels of trust, somewhat higher than trust in the media in general, but they tend to be very polarized. So the Telegraph, for example, amongst the nationally representative sample of the UK public, 41% of our respondents say that they regard the Telegraph as trustworthy, but the differences by political orientation are very, very pronounced. So it's a slight majority on the right, 55%, who say they find the Telegraph trustworthy. So even on the right, some trust, but not a huge amount of trust. But amongst those who don't say they have a strong political opinion, trust is much lower, just 28%. And on the political left, there are many more people who say they distrust the Telegraph than say they trust it. So, the Telegraph has some credibility and trust amongst conservatives, even after the various incidents, such as Peter Oborne's resignation over the alleged influence of advertisers on its coverage of China. And it's somewhat higher trust across the public than the news media in general. But people who aren't already aligned with the Telegraph's editorial line generally don't really trust it very much, in particular on the political left.
Rasmus, thank you. That was Rasmus Nielsen, Professor of Political Communication at the University of Oxford.
Well, to round off the Prime Minister's week of rejection, it's been reported today that trade talks between the UK and Canada have broken down. That's after 2 years of negotiations between the countries with the aim of replacing an interim deal put in place during the aftermath of Brexit. Joining us now to discuss is Evie Aspinall, who is Director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Evie, great to have you with us. So the big promise post-Brexit was more trade deals with the likes of India and the US. In particular, in the case of Canada, this was more of an extension of something that was already in place as opposed to a brand new trade deal. What went wrong with the Canada negotiations?
I think the main problem we've had with the Canada negotiations has been around beef. So the UK has high standards when it comes to beef, and there's a lot of public concern about hormone-filled beef. And that's become the real sticking point. It became an issue in the Australian negotiations, and it's a big sticking point in the Canadian negotiations. And Canada themselves have also got their own challenges domestically. There's lots of pressure from cheese producers, which have really challenged negotiations. And both sides, I think, especially for the UK, we're going into an election season. It's really hard to negotiate a trade deal that you think might upset the domestic population when you can't show very clear economic and direct economic benefits from it.
So they couldn't get past the beef, Evie. But is the UK just not very good at these kind of trade negotiations? There have been a string of sort of stalled ones. You look at India, you look at the US. Are they out of practice?
I mean, there's definitely something around the UK has to strengthen its muscle in making these negotiations. We haven't done it for a long time. Post-Brexit, we suddenly have to do a lot. We have to build the capacity of the civil service when it comes to trade very, very quickly. So there is definitely something about we need to learn quickly. I also think we have to be realistic and pragmatic. Actually, the UK isn't a massive, we're a big, important economic player, but there are others rising quickly with massive markets, India, for example. And we do have a tendency to go into these negotiations thinking that we are the big and important power. And actually, sometimes we need a bit of humility in these negotiations.
Is that something that the UK has more broadly an image problem with post-Brexit? Is that it's trying to define itself in this new way? And is it struggling to communicate that internationally?
I think definitely. I think one of the challenges we've had in foreign policy in general is the UK's announce this big ambition for global Britain. And there is a role for us in the world. We've got amazing soft power assets. We've had big influence all over the world, and we still have many of those strengths. For example, higher education jumps out, sport, football, really, really strong assets. But the problem is trying to leverage those in economic negotiations and positioning ourselves as not alien to the world. Brexit doesn't mean that we hate the world. Actually, we're kind of now at the point we're trying to position ourselves as an important power, and that we're willing to negotiate and we're willing to engage internationally. But getting that messaging right has proved very tricky so far.
You've led me to the perfect question, Evie, which is, imagine you're running sort of the UK's trade mission then, and you're redesigning it to be sort of more self-aware. What are the big selling points? You're going to go meet a new country, let's say China. What are you going to be stressing?
For me, 100% higher education, particularly in many of the nations in the Indo-Pacific, areas where we really think, we want to strengthen our relations, particularly from a security angle. So Indo-Pacific is very important as we kind of look to counter China. Many of these nations, what they look for most of the UK is our education sector. That's one of our biggest assets. It's one of the biggest challenges we're having at the moment. We're incredibly reliant on international students. So we need a more sustainable funding model. But that, I think, is our real asset. The other is just the services of the UK offers in general. The finance sector is absolutely massive. And as I mentioned before, sport, football, the Premier League, we can't ignore it, is a really, really powerful asset. And actually, the way that many nations all around the world engage the UK is through football.
What about the prospect, I suppose, of an election this year? You mentioned that that's obviously a limiting factor when it comes to making long-term commitments as well. Are other countries getting excited about the prospect of a change of government? If that's what the polls bear out and Labour are in charge after the election, could that see a shift in the UK's foreign policy?
I mean, definitely. I think it depends who you ask. So, for example, I think there's lots of concerns that actually if Donald Trump gets elected, which seems increasingly likely, how Donald Trump and Labour might work together would be very interesting dynamic, not least because Labour has a very values-driven foreign policy approach. But if you look perhaps to the EU, they're very excited, many of them, about the prospect of improving trading relations with the UK. Actually, there's quite a lot of public support we now see for improved trade relations with the EU, with some important caveats. And actually, those nations will be very excited. Other nations, perhaps those that the UK has been more willing to engage with under the current government, whose values don't directly align with our own always. So, for example, the kind of nations that James Cleverly's tried to approach through what he has termed patient diplomacy, I think some of them might be sitting a bit nervous that Labour won't be as willing to engage with those nations, particularly perhaps in the Indo-Pacific.
You mentioned Labour and the EU there. Are you optimistic for a change in relations between the EU under Labour? Like, they say they want a better trade deal.
I think there will definitely be a change in relations. Partly it's emotional. I think a lot of the EU will welcome what they see as a party coming in that's more willing to engage with them. There will still be many of the kind of limitations that we currently see. So we're not going to manage to completely renegotiate the EU trade agreement. That's very, very unlikely. There might be bits of it we can tweak and opportunities to work more closely together, but it's not going to be a fundamental overhaul. And it's not really in the EU's interest for there to be a fundamental overhaul, because ultimately, we saw this in the Brexit negotiations, the EU is too nice to the UK, then suddenly you might see other nations quite willing to kind of go off on their own as well. So there's always that kind of in their back of their heads. And there's also a sense of pride, you left us, you're on your own. That still will be there even with a new government coming in in the UK. But I think there'll be opportunities that they'll want to seize to kind of strengthen those relations again.
You touched on Trump a bit earlier. In this world we live in now, where things seem more globally insecure, you look at Israel, you look at Ukraine, you look at sort of questions over Taiwan's future. Does that change the way we think about trade if we live in this more multipolar world going forward?
I mean, I think we see actually trade coalescing in certain regions. So we see kind of a division, particularly we've seen it around sanctions on Russia. We've seen kind of a divide into the eastern and western spheres of influence when it comes to trade. One of the big concerns will be that Trump is quite anti-trade. So one of his big proposals that I don't think will happen, but he's talking about introducing 10% import tax on all trade. I don't think that will happen, but I think it speaks to his approach to kind of global trade. It's not his priority. He's really focused on kind of American domestic economic success. And actually, I think the big challenge for the UK, rather than actually the individual free trade agreements, is this kind of bigger piece around promoting free trade and protecting the infrastructure around free trade globally over the next 4 years under a Trump presidency.
Okay, Evie, thanks so much for your time and insights on the show today. Evie Aspinall, our Director of the British Foreign Policy Group, which is a think tank that seeks to strengthen the UK's international engagement. Great to get your views on the day we've had this pause on the trade deal between the UK and Canada, but interesting to reflect, I suppose, on how a potential change in government is being viewed elsewhere in the world in this, prospect of trade relations coming up, and that being a key issue for the next government too. That's it from us for today, though. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Marufal Hussain. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.